Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us to celebrate the career of Ron Tandberg and the launch of this exhibition and his book. A very warm welcome in particular to members of Ron's family. His daughters Jess, Penny and Sarah, his son Jim and his brother Ken. We know what a terrible time you have had in recent months. We hope this gathering of so many others who were close to Ron over so many years will be a powerful reminder that you are not alone in your loss. We acknowledge also the presence of a number of former editors of The Age, all of whom basked in the reflected glory of Ron Tandberg. We also have a roll call of some of the great newspaper cartoonists of the modern era, friends all of Ron Tandberg: Peter Nicholson, John Spooner, Vane Lindsay, Matt Golding, George Haddon, Andrew Dyson, Rolf Hyman, Michael Leunig. What a gathering. When I started at The Age 1 or 2 years ago, certain things about the newspaper were as comfortingly familiar as night and day. Michelle Grattan, Green Guide, The Odd Spot, We Were Wrong. Not anymore. And Ron Tandberg. Then Michelle moved on. Green Guide flirted with unpredictable hues. Some of the spots got truly odd, and the paper stopped fessing up to being wrong whenever it was. But throughout the wild upheavals of the digital age, the endless redundancies, and the circulation drift, Tandberg remained a reassuring constant for his colleagues and the embattled ranks of loyal Age readers until the 8th of January 2018. Ron's work was brilliant and unique. The simplicity of line that so often disguised, for a moment at least, the sharp political and social observation wrapped in wry humour. Once, when I was night editor, he came to me with the day's cartoon offering. It was good, and I remarked how effortless the creation seemed. Perhaps my tone suggested a criticism that was never intended. The artist shot right back. Okay, you do it. About 18 months ago, Ron began talking with publisher Michael Wilkinson about doing a new book of his work. The advent of Donald Trump gave new impetus to the project. Ron was at once appalled and excited. There had been other great moments and great characters: Jeff Kennett, Sir John Kerr, Malcolm Fraser and Tony Abbott. But Trump might trump the lot, a global nightmare and a cartoonist's dream. Ron mused, to Michael Wilkinson, this could become the best time of his career. Then illness struck. Ron would go on to chronicle his battle with cancer, not with self-pity, but with the same warmth, wit, irony, and piercing satire that had infused his work over the preceding half-century. And he kept drawing, the incurable cartoonist, until almost the end. The book we launched today, A Year of Madness, is a fitting legacy to that phenomenal career. This evening we have several speakers who will talk briefly, I hope, about the irrepressible talent that was Ron Tandberg. To begin, please welcome the editor of The Age, Alex Lavelle.
Thanks very much, Mark, and to the Melbourne Press Club for being involved in organising this and having all the tickets, and to Jacqueline because I think this exhibition looks fabulous, and she's done many exhibitions here, and I think this one's comfortably the best one. So thanks, Jacqueline, for that. Michael Wilkinson for the publisher, one of the reasons we're here, and the book is available for sale. And what I'd really say about Ron is, in terms of for our readers, I don't think there's anyone who's been more connected to The Age and our journalism than Ron Tandberg. He was someone who had no fear and no favour, but was so smart and so funny, and capturing an idea just brilliantly with a few strokes of a pen. And also so consistent. I think all of us here instantly recognise the Tandberg, and in Melbourne as well. Same thing, the consistency and the simplicity, but yet the cutting humour and wit is just extraordinary. And he's been an inspiration to cartoonists all over Australia, and it's great to see so many here. I'm sure he would be pretty excited to have seen you all. And it was always a highlight for our regular letter writers for a Tandberg to appear with a letter, and also for Age journalists for one of his cartoons to appear with their stories. It was always a real thrill. Ron won 11 Walkley Awards as well, and I think during a 11-year period in the 70s and 80s, he was the Cartoonist of the Year 7 times, which really demonstrates what an outstanding cartoonist and journalist he was. And he was twice a winner of the Gold Walkley, and it's great that he's been nominated for a Quill this year, and I somewhat pity the finalists he's alongside. They may struggle. Now, many of you know Ron and didn't come into the office much in recent years, and I believe he may have mellowed somewhat. Peter Bartlett, our lawyer, said he could have filled 2 books with the cartoons that couldn't run for legal reasons. And he also, as Ron often did with people that he liked and worked with, he sent Peter a personal cartoon, and the cartoon is of Ron in sort of fist up in the air saying "publish and be damned," and the rather harried looking editor on the phone saying, "Please can I speak to Peter Bartlett?" But legal issues weren't really a major feature of his last work, I don't think, but his enthusiasm and passion certainly were. And as Mark alluded to, even when Ron was very sick, he still wanted to draw and confront his illness head on. And this collection of Ron's most recent work is a really great reflection and tribute of the amazing talent, and just proving once again that he was a world-class cartoonist. There are a lot of people here who knew Ron a lot better, but not better than I did, and so I'll leave them to discuss some more personal reflections of their relationship with Ron. But my own part, as I've sort of said, and when he died, that any conversation with Ron, he had that amazing knack of his enthusiasm was so infectious, and you always felt better about yourself, and the world was a better place after a conversation with Ron. And for me, that will be my abiding memory of him. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Our next speaker began as a cadet journalist on the Age in the 1980s. Back then, I think many would have thought she had the makings of a fine journalist, but few would have anticipated that she would become a best-selling author, a formidable cartoonist, and a great satirist. Please welcome Kaz Cooke.
Thank you, Mark. It's a great temptation to hand your old Chief of Staff your handbag, but I've put it on the floor. When I joined The Age as a cadet reporter in the start of 1981, I just turned 18, and so to me, Ron Tandberg was an elderly gent in his declining years. I think he was approaching 40 at the time, and what I could see immediately was he wasn't one of the section editors poncing back from a 4-hour lunch in red braces and smoking a cigar. Ron always looked like a total dag. Jumper, overdue for a haircut, and he had the right kind of twinkle in his eyes that never turned dodgy. He was respectful and he was kind, and his was a mischief with camaraderie. He was about sharing a joke, not using it to unsettle or to show off. And that sharing the joke underpinned his published work. Either he drew a version of what everyone was thinking, the Emperor is totally in the nutty, or he pointed out something that you kicked yourself for not noticing. All really good political cartoonists, I think, need to be a kind of journalist, if he would forgive me for saying so. Ron did win 11 Walkleys, not 11 life drawing prizes. Ron had something to say, he had something to reveal. And it wasn't just the economy of line in Ron's work that made it brilliant, or the sleight of hand that said a big thing in a very small space, or the fact that his drawings didn't look like anyone else's. It wasn't just what is often called distilling, or that he was an idea refiner as well as a heckler. It was also the humanity and the courage. Many managers at the Age over the years have clearly felt soothed and inflated by proximity to power and politicians and money, and Ron just wasn't. Ron Tandberg lived up to that old motto, without fear or favour, and it was delicious to see how he kept lobbing Molotov cocktails at the politicians and the robber barons while they were having lunch with and complaining to the paper's executives who paid themselves millions of dollars. And somehow, against that background, Ron, and through him, the readers of the Age, kept a kind of balance of power. He didn't censor himself. It's right and proper, actually, that a lawyer should have 2 books worth of cartoons that weren't allowed through. His felt tip just kept scraping, ink slightly running into the branch lines of the wood grain of the paper before he got onto totally bleed-proof paper, which I remember we thought was just a technological advance. He did a lot within those little spaces and with his shorthand code. I loved how somebody agitated in his cartoons would look like they were so excited they were running with their heels off the ground, as if they needed a sort of cartoon sound effect to go with it. And his characters were kind of frumpy and unglamorous, but possibly overdue for a haircut, and got the job done. They were like real people. And Ron could do proper caricatures too. Nobody ever had to carry a briefcase with their name on it in a Tandberg cartoon. Ron's cartoons could be devastating revealing of a premier's character or of a bigger issue, and to me his quintessential cartoons were the black and white simple ones. The magistrate saying to an Aboriginal man, "You're a repeat offender. Your grandfather was black, your father was black, and you are black." And in the face of the more recent Baroque idiocy and the inadequacy of our politicians, Ron was sharper and better than ever on asylum seekers and Trump. His combination of fearlessness and mischief was shared by the late John Clarke, who once rang Ron to congratulate him on a piece of Kennet skewering. Ron immediately sent the original of that cartoon to John Clarke, and it stayed up on the wall of his study ever since. So here's to Ron, ordinary and amazing, a dag and totally cool, impervious to intimidation but sensitive to right and wrong. His cartoons are affixed to dunny doors stuck on with peeling, brittle, sticky tape, and in custom-made boxes at the State Library, and in this handsome book being launched tonight. Ron Tandberg was often described as a decorated cartoonist, and it cheers me to think of him as a black and white drawing of a man with his head sticking out of the top of a Christmas tree. He's festooned with awards like a string of fairy lights, and they're all still winking. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaz. Our next speaker was editor of The Age from 1989 to 1992, when the dark shadow of Conrad Black cast across the land. In that sense, he edited The Age at probably the peak of the golden era. Please welcome Mike Smith.
Thanks, Mark. Ron Tandberg used to boast that he had to break in his editors. When he arrived at The Age, the paper had only had 12 editors in 118 years of history. In the next 45 years, Tandberg's years, there were 13. No one in the history of the paper worked for more editors of The Age. They were all tested by Canberra at times. They were all blessed to have him. Over that period, Tandberg defined the personality of the paper better than any individual editor since the man who hired him, Graham Perkin. Tandberg poked at both sides of politics, challenged institutional power, and stuck up for the voiceless, the unemployed, homeless, and disadvantaged. Most of all, he stuck up for the ordinary little man and woman. he saw his job as being unfair to everyone, except those ordinary folk. In the early 70s, Tandberg was spotted by the Age's education reporter who saw his work in the newspaper of the Teachers' Union. Soon Tandberg was with the Age trying to sell his syndicated strip Fred and Others, which had been dropped by the Melbourne Herald. Perkin didn't want that strip, but offered him a trial as a pocket cartoonist on the story of the day. Perkin had been impressed by just about everything he saw at the Sunday Times in London under Harry Evans, and Perkin adopted many of that paper's characteristics on the Age. The Sunday Times had a single-column pocket cartoonist called Mel Calman. His work featured a humble, angst-ridden little man beset by the injustices of the world. Calman listed his recreations in Who's Who as brooding and worrying. Perkin wanted it for a different mood. He wanted something sharper. He wanted Tandberg to draw for page one. Single-column pocket cartoons emerged during the paper shortages of World War II. Tandberg reinvented them and did them better than anyone before or since. His method was more economical than any cartoonist in newspaper history. Never a wasted line, never a wasted word in the captions. The young Tandberg was one of the few people in the office under 40 not intimidated by Perkin's presence. He would challenge Perkin, push boundaries, tease him, and stick up for his gags. But when rebuffed or rejected or censored, he'd accept it, grumble a bit, dust himself off, and come back with something else. News editors briefed Ron on the top stories around 6 o'clock. Sometimes Ron sketched a cartoon in the 60 seconds it would take to describe a story. Often those sketches made you realise what the real nub of the story was, and sometimes his insights even helped decide the ranking of the story. Ron's cartoons and his mind were simple, yet also profound. And infuriating. You could be halfway through a 14-hour shift and sometimes he had his main work done within 5 minutes of walking in the door. He ferreted around the picture department looking for ideas. He had a second desk among the photographers. He knew that photographers, like himself, looked to capture the kernel of a story in a single image. Some of Ron's best work were based on a picture. Malcolm Fraser's Easter Island profile is a good example. Nobody told Tandberg what to draw. Occasionally a desk editor or a section editor would arrive from another publication and make suggestions to Tandberg about a gag. Hey, what about this? Tandberg's eyes would narrow and his mouth and eyebrows would go horizontal in a withering look that said, "Get stuffed." Or he would say, "That's a great idea, you draw it." But he needed and loved sounding boards to test his drafts. He ignored yes men, those who would burst into laughter if Tandberg showed him an ink blot. He learned who to trust and appreciated criticism or being told to keep trying. He loved testing editors, especially new ones. Often he'd show a cartoon that he knew crossed the line, but would have a second one, a better one making the same point in his other hand for when the first one was rejected. He probably drew a few too many cartoons with policemen depicted as pigs, with wiggly tails and checkered hats. When he eventually acknowledged he should give it a rest, he drew a cartoon with the back end of a pig walking out of the frame, tail wagging, and the caption, "Cartoon being withdrawn due to public protest." His relentless depiction of Sir John Kerr as a top-hatted drunk produced one of Ron's favourite letters to the editor. The letter earnestly argued, erudite, referred to Ron's vendetta of character assassination and Sir John Kerr's right to freedom from personal harassment. Ron was undermining democracy itself. The letter said, "We very much get the politicians we deserve because we subject them to such cynical, negative and abusive scrutiny. Inevitably, they react with defensiveness, evasiveness and fabrication. I laugh too at political cartoonists, but I'm afraid I can have little admiration for those amongst them who offer personal attack as social debate. My only other comment is that Tandberg is lily-livered, two-faced and a real mean guy." During the Age tapes, Lionel Murphy affair, Tandberg drew a cartoon with the High Court judge depicted with a prostitute. The editor, already engulfed by political and legal headaches for publishing the tapes, looked at the cartoon as though a dog had deposited something on his desk. It fell upon night editor Pat Boyce to tell Tandberg it wasn't being run. Tandberg replied jokingly, "All right, I'll just go home and kill myself." Pat said, also jokingly, "Okay, but you should leave us something to remember you by." On his way out of the office, Ron dropped a cartoon on Pat's desk that showed a tombstone and a grave with two fingers coming out and the caption, "Censored for the last time." Ron was back the next day. 30 years ago, I studied for a year with about 18 international journalists, people from some of the best and biggest papers in the world. Early in the program, we each gave a presentation on a distinctive characteristic of our papers. I talked about cartoonists because at the time, The Age, for a few years in the 1980s, had the Magnificent Seven. Those journalists from some of the best titles in the world could not believe a single newspaper could have so many cartoonists, let alone so many outstanding ones. Some papers much bigger than The Age had only one. Some simply used a syndicated cartoonist. It was then I realised the Magnificent Seven, including Ron, was almost certainly the greatest team of cartoonists ever assembled on a daily newspaper anywhere in the world. Those journalists admired the superb draftsmanship of John Spooner, the genius of Bruce Petty's political machines, the brutality of Peter Nicholson's cartoons, the wicked humour of Les Tanner, the existentialism of Michael Leunig, and the gentle whimsy of Arthur Horner. But they didn't get Ron Tandberg. Part of it was because you had to know the story to understand Ron Tandberg. He always drew on the story. But it was also because Tandberg's pen was always dripped in irony. And as we know, Americans don't get irony in everyday discourse. Tandberg was ever ironic. He loved winning Walkley Awards, but for a time used his first gold Walkley as a doorstop. On the Thursday before he died, he was called by one of his horse racing partners. Ron assured him he'd be out of hospital by the weekend, and he was. Ironic to the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Our final speaker tonight was a very, very long-time friend of Ron's and colleague as a journalist, for a time as assistant publisher of The Age, and perhaps more particularly as a fanatic about horse racing, Mike Richards.
Thanks, Mark. It's a privilege to be here to honour the memory of the great Ron Tandberg and to celebrate the publication of his latest collection of wonderful cartoons. And it's great to see so many familiar faces from the early years at The Age as well, journalists and cartoonists and editors who were here in the 60s, the 70s and the 80s, as well as in more recent times. I was very lucky to share with Ron the two worlds that shaped his work and life, newspapers and, as Mark says, more recently, racehorses. At The Age as a kid reporter in 1972, I just happened to be in the newsroom on the day that Ron had his job interview with Graham Perkin, the legendary editor-in-chief. And I can still recall a nervous Ron going into Graham's office and later coming out, showing his characteristic impish grin. He'd got the job. A new way of cartooning, a page one pocket cartoon on the main story of the day. And as we know, it was to be a formative partnership with Perkin, and later under a succession of editors like Mike Smith, and especially Creighton Burns and others right up to the present day, including several here tonight. That set Ron on the course that would define his life and contribute so much pleasure to ours as readers for almost 50 years. Those early years saw the flourishing, as we've heard, of a remarkable creative hothouse for cartoonists at The Age, We've heard the names luminous talents like Arthur Horner, Les Tanner, Bruce Petty, John Spooner, Peter Nicholson, Michael Leunig, and many others, some here tonight. This country has seen an extraordinary cavalcade of cartooning greats, none more so than at the age over many years. So following on from Mike's wonderful close-up look at Ron and his work in newspapers and beyond, I'd like to take a slightly bigger picture view quickly of this small picture genius. As we've heard from Mike, Ron's record of achievement is unmatched in terms of the accolades he garnered over the journey, and I won't repeat them. In recent years, I would often send a message by phone to Ron after a particular cartoon had hit its mark. "You didn't miss this morning, Ron," I would text. Within a minute, Ron would be on the phone, chuckling at my recognition of his success. But it was never about him. Ron's depth of understanding of politics and public policy was acute, and his capacity to get to the heart of the matter, as we've heard, was exceptional and well known. But again, as we've heard many times, his singular achievement was in cutting through to its essential meaning. Because as a reader, one can get a bit lost in a major story because of the complex strands in it. Ron's gift was rendering the issue intelligible and funny in an image and just a few words in a caption. When we look at the work exhibited in this gallery tonight and the book that reproduces them, we're struck again and again by the simplicity, the economy, the clarity, and the art of it all. And I do think of Ron as an artist who worked at his art until it distilled an essential truth about life and politics, about the world we inhabit. Ron always pushed it further. He crystallised our pre-conscious thoughts, expressed our still emerging thoughts for us in ways that we could then recognise, acknowledge and acclaim. Put another way, Ron's cartoons got to the point before we did, in portraying something true and compelling about a momentary sliver of politics and life, and we laughed along with him in his witty insight. As with art, and particularly poetry, Ron's cartoons look freshly minted, tossed off almost, but they disguise, as we've heard, an intense capacity to get the image right and particularly express the ironic sentiment clearly and economically. Technically, of course, Ron was an exceptional artist. We can see that in the sketches that conclude this book. But he disguised it in his simple lines and lyrical captions. Ron distilled his captions until they reached a witty, simple and sharp point. A point that typically skewered bullying and cruelty and lack of compassion and pricked pomposity, prejudice and hypocrisy. It should quickly be said, I think, that Ron was never driven by malice in his cartooning. Indeed, a gentler soul in the rough and tumble world of politics and media would be hard to find. Ron just didn't have a malicious bone in his body. When he chuckled about his work, it was from the professional pleasure of having the arrow find its mark, and never from any pain that it inflicted on his subjects. Now, no tribute to Ron would be complete without mentioning his enduring love for horses. He came late in life to breeding and racing horses, and it provided a wonderful interest and outlet for him, although his wry cartoon humour was never far away. In fact, Ron designed his racing colours with the smiling everyman of his cartoons on the front and back of the jockey's silks. I suspect horse racing appealed to Ron because of the colourful characters and richness of the racetrack, and characteristically he was always keen to support young and up-and-coming trainers and jockeys. Ron was famous among his co-owners, of which I was one, for his concern for the welfare of the horses. Above all else, he didn't want his horses to be worked too hard. He didn't believe in racing horses as 2-year-olds, and he'd give instructions to bring them on for a preparation for just a few weeks, and then just as quickly he'd send them off on a break. We knew he was right, but this used to drive his co-owners nuts. In fact, he was so persistent about this gentle approach that a few years ago, the hard-working wife of one of our co-owners chanced to pick up a cheery fax from Ron reporting that our horse was going to the Gold Coast for another holiday. Well, she was indignant. "I don't get to go to Queensland for a holiday," she said loudly. But for Ron, it was the love of the animals that drove his passion. The trainer we've had in recent years, George Osborne, was interviewed about Ron not long after he died. "I've been in this game a long time," George said, "and he'd be up there with the best owners. He was such a humble man. I didn't realise how famous he was," George said. "His horses knew him. Once they saw Ron, they put their head down and got a pat." Sometimes Ron would share his thoughts with his co-owners about our nags via a cartoon that he would send to us. One of the funniest cartoons he sent showed a pack of horses going past the finish line, with one trailing last, a distant 20 lengths behind the field, with the owners blankly looking on. The caption has the trainer saying, "Now, wasn't that worth waiting for?" It beautifully summed up Ron's love and understanding of horse races. Horses actually figured in Ron's published cartoons from time to time as well. His famous drawings of a sozzled Governor-General Sir John Kerr at the races at the time of the dismissal of the Whitlam government in 1975 sometimes had a horse in it, looking quizzical, knowingly alert to the real meaning of events going on around it, and sometimes providing a wry comment on the main caption. I like to think that Ron's cartoon horses and their thoughts are the closest we got to his private view of the world, a counterpoint to the characteristic Tandberg take, not at odds with it, but a wry, more informal expression of it. Perhaps it allowed a fleeting glimpse of Ron as the innocent abroad, the innocent that in many ways he was. At times the horse looks bewildered, shocked, dismissive and disbelieving, but always benign. That was Ron Tandberg, always asserting the virtues of a kind, passionate and humorous life well lived over the desolation of vanity, cruelty and arrogant self-interest. Even as the end approached for Ron, he could not resist drawing himself as a patient in hospital, vulnerable, weakened, dependent on the expertise and care of others, but always hopeful, never prepared to submit without a fight, and importantly, offering a passing jibe at the absurdity of it all. How to sum up? With Ron's passing, Australia has lost someone and something very special to the life of our nation. Ron Tandberg came to be our daily bellwether of national politics. He would deliver a verdict on the most salient issue of the day, outing the pompous, exposing the unjust and the hypocritical, skewering the double standards of politicians, or just ridiculing the bizarre quality of what passes for government and politics in Canberra these days. That is now gone, and I often wonder what he'd make of the goings-on since he left us. His loss leaves a deep void that cannot be filled. Since this occasion is a memorial tribute to Ron, as much as an exhibition and publication of his recent work, it's appropriate for me to say just a few final words about Ron and his family. Simply put, the Tandberg we know would not have been without his extended family, particularly his children and grandchildren and his brother, especially his soulmate Glenn. They were his beacons, his guiding stars, who both sustained him on his stellar path as a cartoonist and gave grounded meaning to his remarkable life. So as we remember our gentle friend and gifted colleague tonight and celebrate his distinctive and gentle take on the world as a troubadour of our national life and politics, we express to them our love and heartfelt sorrow at his passing, and we join with them in mourning his loss. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In all the words that have been spoken tonight, if we needed any reminding, and I'm sure we didn't, all of those, so many of us in this room who knew Ron, who worked with Ron, who rejoiced in his work, it was an honour to have had that experience. There's no doubt in my mind, and I think most of you will agree with me, that his memory will live long. The greatness of his work will also live long, and in a small way, I think this book will help that process.